Alright, starting. So we're just gonna retread what we did last week, or rather what I and Ivan did last week, because most of you weren't here. And that is going over finitude and restriction and ought once again. Hopefully we make it quite a bit farther than last week. I definitely had to do some thinking on this one because as we were reading it, I did not remember any of it, and it genuinely felt like something new for the first time since we started reading this, which is both good and bad. Good because I get to learn things, not just you. Bad because you get to suffer my having to repeat shit trying to understand it. Alright, page 101 of the PDF, see Finitude. Well, that is their problem. We're gonna go ahead. Alright. Finitude. Existence is determinate. Something has a quality, and in this quality it is not only determined but delimited. Its quality is its limit, and affected by it, something remains affirmative, quiescent existence. So just interesting there, there's a difference. The difference is acknowledged between the something and its quality, existence and existence in general, and then qualitative being. But so developed that the opposition of its existence, the negation as the limit immanent to this existence, is the very in itselfness of the something. And this is thus only becoming in it. This negation constitutes the finitude of the something. Yeah, we're on page 101 of the PDF, Finitude. Another interesting thing when he says, but so developed that the opposition of its existence and of the negation as the limit immanent to this existence is the very in itselfness of the something, and this is thus only becoming in it. This negation constitutes the finitude of something. So limit, I think I mentioned that when we went over it, but just to mention it again, limit is another version of becoming. It's the kind of concept which, like in its very conception, has to shift out of itself. It cannot stand on its own. It doesn't. It isn't intelligent. Its intelligibility is exactly pointing out something else. And the link between the limit immanent to this existence is the very in itselfness of the something. That is, that something is in itself via its limit. Oh, is that what you were referring to, like when you were talking about Rocco's Modern Life?
Yes.
He's never been in like the group as far as I remember. I mean,
He said he was going to today.
Oh.
He said earlier, tonight works for me, I'm going to start coming more. When we say of things that they are finite, we understand by this that they not only have a determinateness, that their quality is not only reality and existent determination, that they are not merely limited and as such still have existence outside their limit, but rather that non-being constitutes their nature, their being. Finite things are, but in their reference to themselves, they refer to themselves negatively. In this very self-reference, they propel themselves, beyond their being. They are, but the truth of this being is, as in Latin, their finis, their end. The finite does not just alter as a something in general does, but perishes. And its perishing is not just a mere possibility, as if it might be without perishing. Rather, the being of such finite things is to have the germ of this transgression in their innate selfness. The hour of their birth is the hour of their death. So something to take out of that is, I think I mentioned this in the other thing, but something to note structurally is that the pure negative as such seems to be the term in which we always find the true movement of things. In being a nothing, it was nothing which spoke the true contradiction. Nothing is, which really gets the dialectic going. In something and other, it's the other which speaks the true contradiction, which gets the whole dialectic fully explicit in itself from one standpoint. And here, finitude is also going to be the term which speaks the contradiction, which infinitude at its face value, because it is the affirmative and is usually just taken as that as its face value, is the one that can speak the true content of both. So, just something interesting. Something noticed as like the finite things are, but in the reference to themselves, they refer to themselves negatively. In this very self-reference, they prepare themselves, beyond their being. So remember that the other, something, negative self-reference. Haha, there you go. One of the structural things that we see that is necessary for self-reference is self-othering. It's going beyond oneself, or the thing going beyond itself, or the concept going beyond itself. So it's a curiosity of what self-identity requires, what self-reference implies. Self-reference is always a negative self-unity. It's as if the thing repelled itself from itself, despite it being itself. Alright, so continuing, what is that? Is that alpha, the immediacy of finitude?
Yeah.
The thought of the finitude of things brings this mournful note with it, because finitude is qualitative negation driven to the extreme, and in the simplicity of such determination there is no longer left to things an affirmative being distinct from their determination as things destined to ruin. Because of this qualitative simplicity of negation that has returned to the abstract opposition of nothing and perishing to being, finitude is the most obstinate of the categories of the understanding. Negation in general, constitution, limit, are compatible with their other, with existence. Even the abstract nothing by itself is given up as an abstraction. But finitude is negation fixed in itself, and as such stands in stark contrast to its affirmative. The finite thus does indeed let itself be submitted to flux. This is precisely what it is, that it should come to an end, and this end is its only determination. The finite thus, its refusal is rather to let itself be brought affirmatively to its affirmative, the infinite, to be associated with it. It is therefore inseparably posited with its nothing, and thereby cut off from any reconciliation with its other, the affirmative. The determination of finite things does not go past their end. The understanding persists in this sorrow of finitude, for it makes non-being the determination of things, and, at the same time, this non-being imperishable and absolute. The transitoriness would only pass away in their other, in the affirmative. Their finitude would then be severed from them, but this finitude is their unalterable quality, that is their quality which does not pass over into their other, that is not into the affirmative, and so finitude is eternal. So prior page is a footnote. He says, footnote 54, as in Latin their finis, blah blah blah, is my gloss, the translator's gloss. The Latin root of finite in finitude is finis, that is end. This connection between finite and end is clear in the German Endlichkeit, Ende, and Hegel plays on it. I have tried to bring out this wordplay, which in English implicates the Latin word. Determination means both, determination is translated from Bestimmung, which means both determination and destiny of vocation. So when the determination of finitude is its end, that's literally because the destiny of finitude is to end, quite properly. So, I mean, just noticing something here. The finite seems to be the something in its totality posited as a negative against its limit. That the limit is somehow the infinite, and the infinite is fully beyond the finite. So when he says the determination of finite things does not go past their end, it's like the in itself stopping at the being for other, but not realizing, not explicitly affirming that the in itself is in and through the being for other as well, that it is determination. So it takes the in itself as absolute, and this in itself is taken as the negative, as the non-being, and so non-being is the absolute. It's definitely a pessimistic thing. Of course, that's a contradiction, because the understanding persists in this sorrow of finitude, for it makes non-being the determination of things, and at the same time this non-being imperishable and absolute. So it's supposed to be finite, but it's made absolute and therefore infinite. It's supposed to be perishable, but it's not allowed to perish. And thus, finitude is eternal. This is a very important consideration. But that the finite is absolute is certainly not a standpoint that any philosophy or outlook or the understanding would want to endorse. The opposite is rather expressly present in the assertion of finitude. The finite is the restricted, the perishable. The finite is only the finite, not the imperishable. All this is immediately part and parcel of its determination and expression. But all depends on whether one's view of finitude in one's view of finitude its being is insisted on, and the transitoriness thus persists, or whether the transitoriness and the perishing perish. The fact is that this perishing of the perishing does not happen on precisely the view that would make the perishing the final and the finite. The official claim is that the finite is incompatible with the infinite and cannot be united with it, that the finite is absolutely opposed to the infinite. Being, absolute being, is ascribed to the infinite. The finite remains held fast over against it as its negative, incapable of union with the infinite. It remains absolute on its own side. From the affirmative, from the infinite, it would receive affirmation and thus it would perish. But a union with the infinite is precisely what is declared impossible. If the finite were not to persist over against the infinite, but were to perish, its perishing, as just said, would then be the last of it. Not its affirmative, which would be only the perishing of the perishing. However, if it is not to perish into the affirmative, but its end is rather to be grasped as a nothing, then we are back at that first abstract nothing that itself has long since passed away. So I think that's a bit confusing in the phrasing of the perishing and the perishing of the perishing. Going up a bit halfway, when he says, but it all depends on whether in one's view of finitude its being is insisted on and the transitoriness thus persists, or whether transitoriness and the perishing perish. So it's readily acknowledged that the finitude is destined to perish. Here being is, somebody asked, is he saying that being is infinite? He's saying that here being is equated as the moment of the infinite, whereas the finite is equated as the moment of nothing. And the presupposition of natural consciousness or common understanding is that being and nothing are absolutely separate and distinct. So is being self-determined like God? No, we're not talking about that kind of thing yet so far. I mean, he's just talking about what people normally ascribe to these. So far, just think about it to the limits of what we have developed so far, you know. Normally, talking about theologically here, at least in theology, at least Christian theology, the infinite is God, and it's the pure being, the true being, and we are all contingent beings, and therefore nothings compared to them. Well, I mean, it's not even theological. It's literally endemic to common understanding. You see this in scientism as well. You know, what do people say? Well, you know, in the universal scope of things, we are nothing. You know, from the standpoint of physics, we don't exist. Because what is it that really exists according to physics? Nothing but molecules, well, nothing but quarks and forces. You know, consciousness doesn't exist, it's just an illusion. You know, life doesn't really exist, it's just a bunch of atoms moving around together, you know, this sort of strange unity which we don't understand, but, you know, hey, it's all physics in the end. You know, we are nothing. We are finite forces, and quarks, matter it's as such, is infinite. It is true being. So as you can see, atheists and theists have quite a bit in common there. But anyways, back to what I was getting at. Getting finitude right and getting it wrong is literally just on that shift. It all depends on whether in one's view in one's view of finitude, its being is insisted on, and the transitoriness thus persists, or whether the transitoriness and the perishing perish. And that's a bit of wordplay, and if you've listened to the prior one, especially the one about the prior discussion on other of the other, I talk about reflection, about this self-othering aspect in which the affirmative things are always negations of negations. Well, according to physics, a lot of things, and I mean, it's not that physics itself speaks, or even physicists speak as a whole. I mean, there's literally both sides of the aisle right here, in which physicists will speak about the ultimate truth of things. So you do have plenty of physicists who will speak about the ultimate reality of things just being, well, you know, nothing but quantum fluctuations, you know, a void of a quantum foam or whatever. And everything else on top of it is, you know, just, that is phenomena. But that is the true being in itself. Quantum vacuum is a technical term, yes. And what about it? I mean, I'm not, as far as I am conceiving it, I'm not saying anything that's against that. Doesn't matter, even if it was an untechnical term, it's still... They're treating it as the absolute. The point of the whole exercise is see what the structure of what they say is, rather than what they say themselves. I mean, physicists say they don't believe in metaphysics, but they're always doing metaphysics. So, in a way, it doesn't matter what they say about themselves, so much as what they do. But anyways, back to the perishing of the perishing. He says, the fact is that this perishing of the perishing does not happen on precisely the view that would make the perishing the final end of the finite. So understanding the perishing of the perishing is crucial in whether you understand perishing's carrying out to be nothing, to lead back to nothing, or whether you understand the perishing of the perishing speculatively, such that perishing in the absolute sense operates on itself. Therefore, you have a sort of mathematical relation of the negative to negative, which produces a positive. It's another way to say it is the death of death. So if we think that the death of death would be, non-existence back to nothing, that'd be weird. The more proper way to understand that is literally death dies, so there is no more death, there is life. But it's another way to think about that. So if we understand that the perishing is literally just the final end, back to nothing, well, then we go back to the abstract nothing, the absolute abstract nothing, which we began with, and we know that where that leads us, that we've already gone way past beyond it, so returning back to it is not an option. It can't be the actual intelligibility of finitude. So the perishing of perishing is literally the category applied to itself. Continuing to the next paragraph. With this nothing, however, which is supposed to be only nothing, but to which reflective existence is nevertheless granted in thought, in representation, or in speech, the same contradiction occurs as we have just indicated in connection with the finite, except that in the nothing it just occurs, but in the finite it is instead expressed. So this is a return back to the contradiction of nothing is. We intend the nothing to be this absolute other of being. As a matter of fact, something so absolute other that shouldn't even be. So to speak of it itself is a contradiction. To give it a name, to speak of the absence enclosed in a thought itself is already giving it a contradictory existence. So reflective existence is nevertheless granted in thought, in representation, or in speech. The same contradiction occurs as we have just indicated in the connection with the finite, except that in the nothing it just occurs, but in the finite it is instead expressed. So while that contradiction is implicit in nothing, here it is fully explicit. In the one case, the contradiction appears as subjective. In the other, the finite is said to stand in perpetual opposition to the infinite, in itself to be null and to be as null in itself. So the contradiction of nothing is would just be said to be subjective. You said, oh, well, that's just an artifact of thinking, It's not that nothing really exists. It's just like, the thought of nothing exists in your mind, but nothing doesn't actually exist out there. But with finitude, we definitely do mean that finitude is nothing. That it is in perpetual opposition to the infinite, in itself to be null and to be as null in itself. And as far as I see it and comprehend it, I don't see any contradiction there with any ideas of common thinking. I mean, the common idea is indeed, yes, everything finite is destined to nothing. That is the usual way we understand it. This is now to be brought to consciousness. The development of the finite will show that expressly as its contradiction. It collapses internally, but that in this collapse, it actually resolves the contradiction. It will show that the finite is not just perishable, and that it perishes, but that the perishing, the nothing, is rather not the last of it, and that the perishing rather perishes. Restriction and the art. Anyways, any questions on that section, whole section? Joshua says, sounds similar to the conclusion of becoming. Yeah. Finitude is a... It definitely has becoming in it. It's not like limit where it's... Well, no, actually, hell. It probably... Well, we'll see. We'll see. I think it definitely shares a similarity with limit, in which limit immediately has to point beyond itself, and that's exactly what finitude has to do. So yeah, and the limit was also structurally sort of a way more concrete becoming. Alright, restriction in the art. This contradiction is indeed abstractly present by the very fact that the something is finite, or that the finite is. But something or being is no longer posited abstractly, but reflected into itself, and developed as being in itself, that has determination and constitution in it, or, determinedly still, in such a way that it has a limit within it, and this limit, as constituting what is immanent to the something and the quality of its being in itself, is finitude. It is to be seen what moments are contained in this concept of the finite something. So finitude as such, general finitude, is just something limited. That's the structure of it. It's something in immediacy with its limit. Continuing, determination and constitution arose as sides for external reflection, but determination already contained otherness as belonging to the in itself of something. On the one side, the externality of otherness is within the something's own inwardness. On the other side, it remains as otherness distinguished from it. It is still externality as such, but in something. So in case there was any confusion towards to anybody, that the something in other development was between two things outside of each other, the reality is no, it's actually all within one single thing. The otherness is within. But further, since otherness is determined as limit, itself as negation of the negation, the otherness immanent to the something is posited as the connection of the two sides, and the unity of the something with itself, to which both determination and constitution belong. Is its reference turned back upon itself, the reference to it of its implicitly existing determination, that in it negates its immanent limit. So that is literally the whole summary of what something is. And I think it's important to note that he says the otherness is determined as limit. That originally we take the other of the other to be the something of something. Then we develop limit and we find out that limit is the real other of the other, as opposed to something to something. But it still makes sense because limit is what splits the something against itself. So that is what the unity of the something with itself, to which both determination and constitution belong, is its reference turned back upon itself, the something being in itself, the being of something, or the something of something, the reference to it, of its implicitly existing determination that in it negates its immanent limit. And that is that the self-reference is the negation of negation. Something is the non-being of limit, so it's the negation of its immanent limit within itself. There's a whole lot of nested structural recurring structures here. Continuing, the self-identical in itself thus refers itself to itself as to its own non-being, but as negation of the negation, as negating that which at the same time retains existence in it, for it is the quality of its in itselfness. So I think that one's interesting. The self-identical in itself thus refers itself to itself as to its own non-being. So to say something is being in itself is kind of weird. You make this... It's basically saying being is being in itself. You make this inner distinction between being against being, as if being were a non-being to being. And all identity statements actually work like this. You say I am I, as if you aren't the I, as if you are other to yourself. And yet the reality is, indeed, you are other to yourself, and you're not other to yourself. It is you, and it is not you. It's interesting. So continuing, something's own limit, thus posited by it as a negative, which is at the same time essential, is not only limit as such, but restriction. So restriction here is the unity of something and limit. And something here also means determination. So restriction is the unity of something and limit in let me just sorry. Restriction is the unity of something and limit. It is from the standpoint of something with limit as the negative. So it is limited something, the moment of non-being in finitude. This harkens back to the relations of quality. The restriction is the non-being moment of finitude. It also can be understood as the repetition of the structure of being for other, such that a limited something is something being for limit. Continuing, but restriction is not alone in being posited as negative. The negation cuts two ways. For that which it posits as negated is limited. Is limit. And limit is in general what is common to something and other, and is also the determinateness of the in itself determination as such. This in itself consequently as negative reference to its limit which is also distinguished from it, as negative reference to itself, as restriction is the ought. So on the sides of limit you have determination and determination, which is the being in itself of something. So he says, this in itself consequently as negative reference to its limit, which is also distinguished from it, as negative reference to itself as restriction, is the ought. So the in itself is the negative or the non-being of its non-being, which is limit. So that is the ought. The ought is the unity of something and limit. From the standpoint of the positive, the standpoint of being. It's the repetition of being in itself. It is the non-being of its non-being, which is restriction. So we can understand this as the restriction of the restriction. But also it is literally the he says so as negative reference to itself as restriction is the ought. The negative reference to itself here is of something as being restricted by something, or determination being restricted by determination. And that is what the ought is. So the easy way to understand this is it's a repetition of the in itself and the being in itself and being for other. Restriction is being for other. Ought is being in itself. Is that clear? It's a bit hard because it starts getting a bit confusing with how many layers there is in this. Yes, no, you guys got it? Can you hear me? All right. Continuing, in order for the limit that is in every something to be a restriction, the something must at the same time transcend it in itself, must refer to it from within as to a non-existent. The existence of something lies quietly indifferent, as it were, alongside its limit, but the something transcends its limit only insofar as it is the sublatedness of limit, the negative in itselfness over against it. And inasmuch as the limit is as restriction in the determination itself, the something thereby transcends itself. So, I suggest you highlight this entire paragraph right there. It's telling of what the movement of finitude and what the infinite will do later on. It's, I think it's pretty key. Continuing, the ought therefore contains the double determination. One says a determination which has an in itselfness over against negation, and again as a non-being which, as restriction, is distinguished from the determination, but is at the same time itself a determination existing in itself. So I think the second part of that is a bit confusing, and again as a non-being which, as restriction, is distinguished from the determination, but is at the same time itself a determination against itself. So, as with what has happened the entire time up to now, every time we think we have made a difference, we find that we don't have that difference. That the ought seems to be actually just as much restriction, and restriction just as much an ought. Here, because if non-being, the non-being moment of finitude is restriction, and the ought is the non-being of restriction, then itself is the restriction of restriction, which is once again like the doubling, the reflection of things. Continuing, the finite has thus determined itself as connecting determination and limit. In this connection, the determination is the ought, and the limit is the restriction. Thus the two are moments of the finite, and therefore both themselves finite, the ought as well as the restriction. But only restriction is posited as the finite, the ought is restricted only in itself, and therefore only for us. It is restricted by virtue of its reference to the limit already immanent within it, though this restriction in it is shrouded in itselfness, for according to its determinate being, that is, according to its determinateness, in contrast to restriction, it is posited as being in itself. So the finite is the unity of the restriction and the ought. They're like, it's like quality, reality and negation were the two moments of quality. Restriction and the ought are two moments of the finite. And to repeat, the determination and the ought and the restriction are unities of determination and limit from respective sides. The ought being the positive moment of finitude from the standpoint of being in determination, and limit as finitude from the standpoint of nothing in the restriction being finitude from the standpoint of nothing from the side of limit. Thus the two are both moments of the finite, and therefore both themselves finite, the ought as well as the restriction. So two forms of finitude, strangely enough. But only restriction is posited as the finite. The ought is restricted only in itself, and therefore only for us. So we'll see it right after. That the ought is posited as somehow the infinite that is the ultimate beyond. Alright, continuing. What ought to be is, and at the same time is not. If it were, it would not be what merely ought to be. The ought has therefore a restriction, essentially. This restriction is not anything alien. That which only ought to be is determination, now posited as it is in fact, namely as at the same time only a determinateness. So, the way I'm understanding what he says here, namely as the same time only determinateness, that is that... What do you think of that one, Hyperion?
What about it?
Well, why did he say that? What ought to be... well, the ought has therefore restriction, essentially. This restriction is not anything alien. That which only ought to be is determination, now posited as it is in fact, namely as at the same time only a determinateness. I get like that which only ought to be is determination, being in itself. That's what we think that's the only thing that should exist, because it's the only real existence.
Yeah.
But now posited as it is in fact, namely as at the same time only a determinateness. Only as a determinateness, that is just only one layer, it's not the true being in itself, which is supposed to be what only ought to be, but clearly it's only one side of a determinateness. It's what's supposed to be, it's what ought to be, and only ought to be, but it's finite, and therefore it itself ought not to be.
Well, it's restricted.
Yeah, it's restricted, so it itself ought not to be, and doesn't live up to its own.
Yeah.
Its own
because it restricts itself. Yeah, because it's not an is, it's an ought.
So now determination is not positive as what it actually is. So determinateness ought to be determination, but it isn't. There's a footnote here, footnote 57. You can read it on your own. I think it just misses so much of the point. They make it more about predicates and grammar than about the metaphysical and ontological, logical implications of this. Continuing, the being in itself of the something is thus reduced in its determination to the ought, because the very thing that constitutes the something's in itselfness is, in one and the same respect, as non-being. Or again, because in the in itselfness, in the negation of negation, the said being in itself is as one negation with negates, a unity with the other, and this other as qualitatively other is the limit by virtue of which that unity is as reference to it. The restriction of the finite is not anything external, but the finite's own determination as rather also its restriction, and this restriction is both itself and the ought. It is that which is common to both, or rather that in which the two are identical. Sorry, just rereading that. It's kind of dense. So the being in itself, the something is thus reduced in its determination to the ought, because the very thing that constitutes the something's in itselfness, in one and the same respect as non-being. In itselfness is in one and the same respect as non-being, or again, because in the in itselfness is negation of negation, the said being in itself is as one negation, what negates a unity with the other, and this other as qualitative other is the limit by virtue which the unity is as reference to it. Wow, that was a long sentence. So the being itself becomes the ought, in part because something is only by virtue of its non-being. And so this non-being is given primacy to overtake the entire determination of, or the entire determinacy of something as finite. Sorry about that. Because in the in itselfness in the negation negation, the said being itself is as one negation, what negates a unity with the other, and this other as qualitatively other is the limit by virtue of which that unity is as reference to it. That is, being is only by virtue of its non-being. The non-being of determination, or something being the limit. The restriction of the finite is not anything external, but the finite's own determination is rather also its restriction, and this restriction is both itself and the ought. It is that which is common to both, or rather that in which the two are identical. But further, as ought, the finite transcends its restriction. The same determinateness which is its negation is also sublated, and is thus in itself. Thus it's in itself. Its limit is also not its limit. As ought, something is thus elevated above its restriction, but conversely it has its restriction only as ought. The two are indivisible. Something has a restriction insofar as it has a negation in its determination, and the determination is also the being sublated of the restriction. So that was more or less clear. That restriction is only restriction in relation to the ought, and the ought is only an ought because it is beyond the restriction. So unless no questions, we'll just move on to the remark. Guys, I don't read minds, so if you don't have questions, just say no questions.
I
or
have no
just
question.
yes? All right. Can you read the remark, Hyperion?
Sure. The ought has of late played a major role in philosophy, especially in connection with morality, but also in metaphysics in general, as the final and absolute concept of the identity of the in itself, or of self-reference, and of determinateness, or the limit. You can because you ought. This expression, which is supposed to say a lot, is implied in the concept of the ought. For the ought is the transcendence of restriction. Restriction is sublated in it. The in itself of the ought is thus identical self-reference, and consequently the abstraction of being able. But conversely, you cannot, even though you ought, is just as correct. For the restriction as restriction is equally implied in the ought. The one formalism of possibility has in it a reality, a qualitative otherness that stands opposed to it, and the connection of each to the other is a contradiction and thus a cannot, or rather an impossibility. In the ought, the transcendence of finitude, infinity, begins. The ought is that which, in the subsequent development, in accordance with the said impossibility, will display itself as a progress to infinity. Regarding the form of restriction and of the ought, two prejudices deserve more detailed criticism. First, much is commonly made of the restrictions of thought, of reason, and so forth, and the claim is made that it is impossible to transcend these restrictions. What is lost track of in this claim is that something is already transcended by the very fact of being determined as a restriction. For determinateness, a limit, is determined as restriction only in opposition to its other in general, that is, in opposition to that which is without its restriction. The other of a restriction is precisely beyond with respect to it. Stone, metal, do not transcend their restriction, for the simple reason that the restriction is not a restriction for them. However, with respect to such general propositions that are typical of the way the understanding thinks, as that it is possible to transcend restriction,
Impossible.
if thought will... as that it is impossible to transcend restriction. If thought will not apply itself to see what is implied in the concept, it can then be referred to actuality, where the propositions prove themselves to be completely unrealistic. Just because thought ought to be something higher than actuality, just because it ought to dwell in higher regions remote from it, and therefore be itself determined as an ought, it fails on the one hand to advance to the concept, and on the other hand, it manages to be equally untrue both in its relation to actuality and to the concept. But because a stone does not think, does not even feel, its determinateness is not a restriction for it. That is, it is not in it a negation for the sensation, the representation, the thought, and so on, which it does not have. But the stone, too, is as a something distinguished in its determination, or its in itselfness, or in itself and existence. And to this extent, it too transcends its restriction. The concept which the stone is in itself contains the identity with its other. If it is a base receptive to acids, then it is oxidizable, neutralizable, and so on. In the process of oxidization and neutralization and so on, its restriction to being only a base is sublated. The base transcends it. Similarly, the acid transcends its restriction to being an acid, and in the acid, just as in the caustic base, the ought, the imperative to transcend the restriction, is so strong that it is only with violence that they can be kept fixed as acid and caustic base, as waterless, that is, purely non-neutral. If, however, a concrete existence contains the concept not merely as abstract in itselfness, but as a totality, existing for itself as instinct, life, sensation, representation, and so forth, it itself then brings about by itself this transcendence and this transcending. The plant transcends the restriction of being a seed, similarly of being blossom, fruit, leaf. The seed becomes the developed plant, the blossom fades, and so forth. In the grip of hunger, thirst, and so forth, the sentient is the impulse to transcend this restriction, and it does transcend it. It feels pain, and to feel pain is the privilege of sentient nature. Pain is a negation within the sentient's self, and this negation is determined as a restriction in the sentient's feeling, just because the sentient has a feeling of itself. And this self is the totality that transcends the determinateness of the negation. If the sentient did not transcend it, it would not feel it as its negation and would have no pain. But reason, thought, is not supposed to be able to transcend this restriction. Reason, which is the universal, which is for itself the beyond of particularity as such, that is, of all particularity, only is the transcendence of restriction. To be sure, not every transcendence beyond restriction is a true liberation from it, a true affirmation. Even the ought itself is this kind of imperfect transcending, and so abstraction in general. But the mention of a totally abstract universal is sufficient to counter the equally abstract pronouncement that restriction cannot be transcended, or again, the mention of the infinite in general is sufficient to counter the pronouncement that the finite cannot be transcended. We can recall in this text a seemingly ingenious notion of Leibniz, that if a magnet had consciousness, it would regard its pointing to the north as a determination of its will, a law of its freedom. Rather, if the magnet did have consciousness, and along with it a will and freedom, it would be a thinking being. Consequently, space would be for it a universal embracing all directions, and its one direction to the north, thus a restriction rather than its freedom. Rather of its freedom. Just as being held fixed to one place is a restriction for a human being, but not for a plant. The ought, for its part, is the transcending of restriction, but a transcending which is itself only finite. It therefore has its place and legitimacy in the field of finitude, where it holds in itself fixed over against what is restricted, declaring it to be the norm and the essential relative to what is null. Duty is an ought directed against the particular will, against self-seeking desire and arbitrary interest. It is the ought held up before a will capable of isolating itself from the truth because of its instability. Those who hold the ought of morality so high as to believe that by not recognizing it as the ultimate truth, morality itself would be destroyed. The brokers of reason, whose understanding takes unceasing satisfaction in being able to confront everything that there is with an ought, and consequently a would-be superior knowledge, who therefore are all the more resistant to being robbed of the ought. These do not see that, as regards the finitude of their sphere, the ought receives full recognition. But in the actual order of things, reason and law are not in such a sad state of affairs that they only ought to be. Only the abstraction of the in itself stays at this. Equally, the ought does not perpetuate itself, nor, which is the same, is finitude absolute. The philosophy of Kant, or Fichte, holds out the ought as the resolution of the contradictions of reason, though it is rather only a standpoint that remains fixed in finitude and therefore in contradiction.
Well, that was a pretty straightforward one, I think.
Yeah, he has a nice insight into the variations on freedom between the the thinking and the non-thinking, I think, with the example of, being fixed, held in a place for a human being would be a restriction of its freedom, but not a plant. A plant can't get up and walk.
Yep. And the thing on morality as well is pretty keen. So
Yeah, that's a Kantian point, obviously.
So you get out of Hegel that if he has a morality, it is not an ought morality.
Yeah. Yeah, Kant's was like the moral or rational necessity of actions. From the, concept of practical reason.
Yeah. The ought has a universal structure. It's not
So
tied
only
to anything
rational.
particular.
Yeah, only rational beings can think that they ought to do something.
But for Hegel, like the ought, if it is truly the ought, it will be tied directly to what supposedly is not yet the ought. As a matter of fact, the ought shall arise exactly from what is not yet the ought. So if he does have morality, then it will be a morality that goes from what we are towards what we should be from what we are, and does not make a disconnect. Does not put down, the being of, well, what we are, how we are, the kind of natural things we do and how we feel.
Yeah.
So Hegel's philosophy is not one in which he'll say, well, don't be selfish. Well, come on. Only care about the community. No. Surely, if you read the introduction to the philosophy of history, he goes a bit about that. He definitely goes a lot more into it, probably in the philosophy of right. But he goes in a bit about that, about how people are foolish to tell people not to be selfish. Like, what is life about, except doing the things that you want to do? But there's more nuance to that. So, what's that Greek letter?
Gamma.
Gamma. Transition of the finite into the infinite. Let's see, can we finish this?
Yeah, this one's short. Or do you mean through infinity? Probably not through infinity.
Yeah, this whole section of infinity is long.
It's almost like it goes on forever.
Alright, well, we'll finish this section on finitude. Then we get to the infinite. Gamma transition to the finite. Transition of the finite into the infinite. The ought contains restriction explicitly for itself, and restriction contains the ought. The mutual connection is the finite itself, which contains them both in itself. These moments of its determination are qualitatively opposed. Restriction is determined as the negative of the ought, and the ought equally as the negative of restriction. The finite is thus in itself the contradiction of itself. It ablates itself. It goes away and ceases to be. But this, its result, the negative as such, is alpha, its very determination, for it is the negative of the negative. So in going away and ceasing to be, the finite has not ceased. It has only become momentarily an other finite, which equally is, however, a going away as going over into another finite, and so forth to infinity. So just to remind you all, the reason determination is brought in, and determination is what is in something. What is in finitude is restriction and the ought, and united they contradict themselves and go away. Or rather, the finite plays itself out and, well, ends. But, is that beta?
Yeah.
If we consider this result more closely and its going away and ceasing to be in this negation of itself, the finite has attained its being in itself. In it, it has rejoined itself. Each of its moments contains precisely this result. The ought transcends the restriction that is, it transcends itself, but its beyond or its other is only restriction itself. Restriction, for its part, immediately points beyond itself to its other, and this is the ought. But this ought is the same direction of it in itselfness and determinateness as its restriction. It is the same thing in going beyond itself. It is the same thing in going beyond itself. Restriction thus equally rejoins itself. This identity with itself, the negation of negation, is affirmative being, is thus the other of the finite, which is supposed to have the first negation for its determinateness. This other is the infinite. And we'll leave it there. That's a good place to end. Unless we get any questions, we'll wrap that up. Alright, cool. So, see you guys next week.